All right, gentlemen, we're going to be doing a couple of sections in chapter 33 here at the very end. And I am actually very sad we won't be in class for 33.1. I realize it would be, near the very end of the year. But this is a lesson that I always find is helpful and informative for many students. It touches upon some political vocab that you have probably heard today or in your life. Conservative and liberal, right? And I think it's very important that we have this lesson because it's going to help clear up a lot of issues with these words in modern day America. Because they are overused words. They're actually two of my least liked words in the English language as of right now, at least living in America. These words get tossed about nonstop. And this is another case where if we were in class, it would be somewhat helpful because I would be a little more able to kind of play off of the responses of the crowd. And, when I make comments about, maybe your grandfather says this, or you've got that person at Thanksgiving who says this, I can watch the eye rolls or the grins or the people who nod. And I know that you have experienced this one way or another. There's a person in your life, perhaps family, they throw around the word conservative or liberal all the time, right? All the time. To the point where the word loses meaning, right? When everything gets described as, I won't even use conservative or liberal, but if somebody calls something amazing, oh, that's amazing, that's amazing, well, then it's not, right? Because the definition of amazing refers to a very specific circumstance, an event that is incredibly rare, right? But if you describe things all the time as amazing, well, then they're not rare because you're talking about them all the time, and you've destroyed the meaning of the word. That's what happens in modern day America and has happened in modern day America, right? What happens is one side, everything they don't like gets labeled conservative, and the other side, everything they don't like gets labeled liberal, right? And that isn't really how it works. Politics is far more complex than that. So hopefully we can shed some light on this. Okay? So what do these words really mean if they don't mean what your crazy uncle or sister-in-law or whoever we might be talking about in your life? What do these words mean if those people don't know what they mean? Okay? All right. So liberal. Okay? What liberal means, and that's the other thing I have to point out before we get started. These words have evolved over time. Today, a person who considers themselves a conservative in modern day America would have been considered a liberal in 1840s England. Okay? The definitions have the right to migrate. But the problem is you got to lock it down in its time and place. Uh, the people who are today called liberals in America would have been called radicals or extremists in 1830, 1840 England or France, right? This was not considered a very legitimate political stance. This was considered a dangerous departure from the norm. This was not considered conservative in 1840s England. This would have been considered part of the Liberal Party. Okay? So there you go. There's another great case or example of why we've got to define our terms. Because if we don't have clear-cut definition of the terms, then we're just throwing around words that have no meaning, right? So what do we mean when we say liberal and conservative in modern day or America, let's say post 1930s? What do we mean? A liberal is a person who tends to favor or believe that there should be strong government regulation in the economy. Um, they take the stance of the system is unfair and it creates a lot of inequity, a lot of inequality. There are a lot of victims. There are a lot of people who are poor and will never be able to escape poverty if the government doesn't step in and help them. There are a lot of people who are oppressed and they won't be able to get out of that without government aid. And so there's this idea that the government should put in place regulations, that there should be rules and regulations to prevent abuses from the wealthy, the elites, the large corporations. They do also believe that the government should play a very active role in trying to help those less fortunate. So we need to have all sorts of programs and financial setups to help provide opportunities for the poor, for the disadvantaged, for those who have recently escaped depression or discrimination or whatever. Okay? Now, you have to have high taxes on the rich. Why? First of all, that will pay for the programs that will help the poor. Secondly, the high taxes on the rich will actually limit their power because it will limit their wealth, which will then limit their ability to do whatever nefarious things supposedly rich people are doing. Okay? Now, while liberals favor the government getting involved and having all sorts of rules and regulations in the economy, on a social side, liberals are very big believers in personal liberty. They believe that there should be basically no government regulations on social behavior. They are massive believers in freedom of speech and privacy. These would be people who are pro-choice, for example. They also are opposed to any government support or endorsement of religion, no matter how indirect, no matter how kind of tangential. They are humongous believers in the separation of church and state. And they believe that a diverse society tends to be a better society because diversity breeds creation and ingenuity and all sorts of stuff. Okay, this is a very big thing. People have written books on this, and I'm trying to distill it down to less than 5 minutes and a few paragraphs out of a textbook. So bear with me. So basically, to sum it up, liberals believe that the government needs to put economic regulations in place to try and end inequality. Okay, and that the wealthy should be highly taxed. The government should get out of your personal life, and religion should be a private matter, and there should be no discussion of it really in the greater society, and diversity is great. Okay? Now, let's go to the other side, conservatives. Okay? Now, conservatives tend to actually distrust government if you look at them historically. Well, I should say, the modern day conservatives. Over the course of modern day conservatism, there tends to be a line of thinking that actually goes down the road of, we don't really like government. We don't really believe in government. We don't really trust government. And conservatives tend to argue that they are following the line of thinking of the founding fathers. The founding fathers had a general distrust of government. They wanted to create a limited government. They purposely created that very divided government with levels and branches and all sorts of stuff to hamper the ability of government to do things, right? And so they believe there should be limited government. And they believe, actually, the lower level the government, the better. The more it is local government, that's great. They don't like the idea of big national government. They tend to favor a little more state power, or even local power. So that is a form of diversity conservatives do believe in. They're okay with the idea of states having their own laws because, it's up to the people to make their own choices, and et cetera. They do believe in very limited government regulation. They tend to favor laissez-faire policies, or as much laissez-faire as is possible, because they believe that that is the best way to organize a society. It allows the maximum generation of wealth. Now, that does not mean that you will eliminate poverty from a system. But it does mean that you will pull more at the thinking, the theory. I'm not telling you this is what will happen. I'm telling you what they believe, okay? The thinking is that a laissez-faire economic policy will generate more wealth overall, right, on the whole. And with more wealth overall, more people will actually be pulled up the ladder. That doesn't mean everyone gets pulled up the ladder. You will still have poverty in a laissez-faire system. You're going to have people get stupendously rich too, far richer than they would get under some of the liberal plans. Okay? But there's no active effort to get rid of poverty through government intervention. They believe it's got to be a marketplace maneuver, right? Something has to occur, what I would call organically in the market. And they basically just argued the more wealth and the higher standard of living everyone gets in the long run. Doesn't mean everybody's equal. You're going to have winners and losers, but even the losers are going to do better than they would have done originally. That's the thinking. They oppose high taxes and all those government programs because they say that destroys incentive in both directions. High taxes on the wealthy is sort of like a windfall profits tax that we talked about with Jimmy Carter. The thinking being, if you tell people, well, if your income gets to a certain level, we're just going to take it all. It's like, well, then why would I strive to make anything above X, right? If X is the cutoff, or I'm really just killing myself to get above X to really gain nothing from it, all that wealth is just going to go to other people, then why should I do it, right? If you can only make $5 million, why try to make 10 or 20 or 50? If you're never going to see the other 30 or 40 million dollars you earned, why earn it? Why go through the effort, right? Just to give it to the government? No. So just make your 10 and call it a day, or 5, or whatever the cap is. On the other side, they argue that programs destroy the incentive for poor people to actually try and work their way out of poverty. They will simply just look to government programs to get by, if as a safety net, as a crutch, however you want to term it. And so conservatives are the people who generally love to point out the fact that America's welfare system has created generational welfare. That there is a very clear connection between people born on welfare, living on welfare, and then having children in welfare, right? They never get out of the program because it's always there, right? Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, laissez-faire and stuff. That is where, this is an example of where, when people say things like conservative and liberal, they don't know what they're talking about. Donald Trump's economic policies are not conservative. A trade war with China, that is not conservative. Tariffs, that is not conservative, right? Doing all sorts of things to bring the jobs back to America, that's not conservative. If you go by the original definition, we should be practicing laissez-faire. If China can do it cheaper than we can do it, let China do it. And the people who lose their jobs here in America, I guess will have to find new jobs, right? They'll have to figure it out, because Lord knows you can't create a program for them. It's, the recent stimulus check we got, that's not conservative, right? That's a bailout. And a bailout is a form of a government program. That's something these people would do, and I find it somewhat funny. I don't find the fact that we've got this situation economically funny. What I find funny, and it's probably something most of my students can't relate to, but I remember about 10 years ago, this guy named Barack Obama proposing this massive bailout and all sorts of stuff. And he wasn't even the first one to do it. George W. Bush did it too, but magically no one talked about it. Barack Obama proposed all sorts of government subsidies and government payments and government bailouts and government spending. And these people lost their minds, right? I mean, Fox News went nuts. And then 10 years later, it's like, here's a couple $1 trillion in random checks, America. Good luck. There's no difference. That's the other reason why I don't like the terms these days. I'm sorry, I'm on a tangent. I'll get back to defining conservatives. That's why I don't like the terms, because they aren't very clear-cut definitions when we apply them to people. There are the ideas of conservative and liberal, but just because a person has an R behind their name doesn't mean they are a conservative across the board. They might lean conservative. Doesn't mean they're always doing conservative things. Just because a person has a D behind their name doesn't mean they're always going to vote this way, okay? All the time. Doesn't mean that these two people can't come together to make something happen politically. But, by and large, these are the beliefs of conservatives. So don't take the actions of modern-day American Republicans and go, well, clearly that's what conservatives do. No, conservatives would never increase tariffs. historic conservatives. They would never start a trade war with China. They would never have a government bailout like the one we just had, where they just sent checks to Americans, right, for not working. You know. Um, One last thing: conservatives tend to believe that religion and values are important for society. That religion has a place, right, in society, and they tend to support it. Now, that doesn't mean they necessarily push for government support, but they aren't as opposed or hostile to religion and society as liberals tended to be. Because conservatives tend to believe that most social problems are the cause of poor choices, right? And they argue that religion creates a moral code, a set of values which tend to help people avoid those poor choices. They also like to argue that religion encourages people to make compassionate choices. You know, the idea of we don't need government programs. People are going to go, well, your system still has poor people in it. You're not avoiding poverty in your system. What's going to happen to the poor people? That's where conservatives would go. Christians believe in charity. They will create their own private charities, which will be far more effective in distributing funds to help out certain groups. But it won't be the kind of guaranteed money like a government program, so it won't completely destroy the incentive. We are going to give people the ability to choose how they donate their money to help the people in trouble, and then they will create their own programs that are not necessarily like the government program. So they do support government sort of being favorable to religion. And I will say, too, conservatives do support the use of government powers to regulate some social behaviors that they feel are destructive to a society. So while they tend to be all pro-Constitution, conservatives are the ones who might not necessarily be favorable to all sorts of freedom of speech, etc., or lifestyles, or diversity, right? Or gay marriage, or whatever. There are certain activities they would be opposed to, right? Now, before we move any further, this is the point where most students, most classes, most years, somebody goes, which one are you? Right? To finally answer the question that's been burning amongst my students for 9 months. I am neither. I am in the middle. And I know everyone's going to go, that's a cop out. No, it's not. Okay? I believe in what the founders believed in. I don't think government is the answer. Government screws things up a lot because government is screwed up. And it's not because we have a bad government. All governments are screwed up. Government by its nature is messed up. Okay? And it's never going to work perfectly. And so why would I want to trust all sorts of power in this very imperfect system? And also, I'd like to also point out the people in government are no better than you and I. They have the same flaws. They have the same vices, the same desires. They like power. Everyone likes power. We're not supposed to like power, but we do, right? Everybody likes money. Everybody likes a lot of the same things. And I know I'm generalizing, but 9 out of 10 people like power and money. And guess what? That means that a good percentage of your politicians are going to be greedy little pigs like the rest of humanity. So if you think they're magically going to be altruistic, you're nuts, right? That's the way I look at it. So I don't believe in a whole lot of government. I believe we need less government. I don't like a whole lot of government regulation. I do tend to favor laissez-faire economic policies. I do think that over the course of human history, the one thing that has pulled the most people out of poverty is just a boom in overall wealth, right? And I think there's a long-term flaw in the idea of placing very high taxes on the rich to pay for programs for the poor. I think that there is a long-term issue there, and that eventually this will dry up. These people will cease to exist. They just simply will start to go away. They will find places to go. They simply will make less money because they're less motivated. You will eventually run out of money. You can't buy your way out of poverty. The government can't buy our way out of poverty. Also, it causes a thing called inflation. Okay, so I'm with them on some of this. I do believe religion has its place, but I'm not like some conservatives. Every few years we have an argument over putting the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. I could really care less if "under God" is in the Pledge of Allegiance. It doesn't matter. Okay, half of my students actually have no idea what they're saying. They robotically say it. All right, you could dramatically change the pledge, and many of them wouldn't. They just say the same old words. Right? I don't think it's important. I don't think we need prayer in school. Uh, I do think religion, I'm not going to be hostile to it like some people on the side of liberalism might be. But I do believe it does provide people with a moral framework, which can be very helpful. It can also be very dangerous because sometimes it does lead to intolerance. And see, this is where I now have to say I can't be a conservative. Go for it, man. If you want to have purple hair, have purple hair. If you want to be homosexual, be homosexual. And you know what? Let them get married. Who's it hurting? What's it destroying? What fabric of society is it ruining? Okay? Um, the Constitution says we have the right to bear arms. All right. Am I a fan of people owning arsenals of M16s in their basements? It's an AR-15. Okay, fine. Regardless, are the deer shooting back? No. Do you have the right to it? Yeah, sure. Like, so I'm conservative in the sense of I'm like, yeah, the Second Amendment. But if somebody were to stand up and actually offer an alternative to the like to revoke the Second Amendment, I would have to consider it. And for people like you can't change the Constitution. Yes, you can. They're called amendments. We've done it a number of times. We used to have slavery, and then we amended it away. You know, but I am liberal in the sense of I do believe in freedom of speech. I believe people have the right to protest. I believe people have the right to demonstrate. I believe people have the right to live alternative lifestyles and a lot of other things. But on the same coin, I'm not 100% there. Like the recent debate over transgender rights and stuff, I'm having trouble, and it's not because again I have a problem with transgender lifestyle. My problem is the how we do this legally. Okay, this is again one of those parts where I don't know if everyone's considered like how do we play this out? How do you enforce it? That's the issue. You got laws, you have to enforce them. If you're not going to use the genitalia that people are bringing to the party, so to speak, to define them, then it's up to their willy-nilly choice. How's the government going to do that? Right? How are we going to actually, somebody's like, I feel like a woman. I should be able to get a college scholarship to play basketball and dominate, right? How are you going to prove that that dude isn't just gaming you? Like, I mean, are we going to make him take a test? He can lie. And then somebody's going to be like, no, he can't. Yeah, he can. If you say that it's a choice, couldn't he, after college, decide, you know what? No, I am a guy. Thanks for the free education, right? That's my issue. I don't think anyone's thought about that one, or at least argued how we're going to deal with it. So again, that's where liberals would be like, no, you're a conservative. Okay? I'm looking at the legal side, not the actual personal choice side. I like diversity, but I'm not as fond of it as liberals might be. I don't have a problem with diversity. I just don't think it's the grand answer to everything. I believe diversity has its place, and it does serve a purpose. Um, but I also think that the mixing is important. The blending of cultures is important because looking at history, that is what produces the results. It is not people clinging to their unique identities. That is not productive. If you look at history, that is actually bad for societies. It's what splinters and fractures them. If you would like a great example, look at the Ottoman Empire. Look at the Russian Empire. Look at a lot of empires. Okay, when you have groups in places and they don't kind of unite around a common identity, but they cling to their old identity, that's when things start to fall apart. If you want to look at success, look at the places or the people who they kind of blended other cultures, like the Romans, right? They blended the Greeks and Etruscans and other stuff together, and the Latins, to make the glory that was Rome over time. So I'm cool with diversity, but I don't think everybody needs their holiday. I don't think that, we should constantly glorify everything as unique and cultural. So I'm a little liberal here, but I'm also a little conservative. So that's why I say I don't fit. I don't fit. Um, I'm sorry. Like I said, if the jobs go to China, the jobs go to China. And that stinks. And I'm an American, and I don't like to see Americans lose their jobs. And I don't like America being dependent on China for anything, right? But I don't see a good alternative. I don't see a current viable financially alternative long term. So that is why I always tell my students, I am not one or the other. If I had to say I do one, I lean a little more conservative, which is a change for me because in my younger days, I leaned a little more liberal, right? As I've gotten older, I've gotten a little more conservative. Um, some of the things I believed or supported on the liberal side of things when I was younger, I've seen fail, or maybe I was just let down. All right. I had buyer's remorse. I don't know. But so there you go. Again, another reason why I wish we had this in class, because I could break it down a little more. Um, so anyhow, now liberals dominated America in the 1930s. Why? First of all, FDR was a liberal, and FDR dominated. And a lot of FDR-style Democrats dominated in the early 30s. We had the Depression, and the answer was the New Deal, right? And that sort of dominated life politically for years, okay? Because the New Deal didn't just go away when the Great Depression went away. Some of those programs, some of those systems remained around for years, right? I told you we didn't get rid of the Civilian Conservation Corps until World War II was underway and we needed men for the draft. Social Security is still there. And guess what? Some of those New Deal programs, we've got modern day equivalents. Remember how we had the national, the thing, oh my goodness, the program that would buy your mortgage and refinance it for you? The HULC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. You can get government loans for home purchases, right? Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac and all sorts of other stuff. So some of these programs just simply got a new name or a rebirth on life and were still around. But the 1930s was a golden era for liberals. But post-World War II, conservatives started to make a comeback. And what allowed conservatism to get back in the game? The Cold War, okay? The Cold War is really what gave conservatives a fighting chance. Because communism is really, it's not about government oppression and control of speech. I mean, obviously everybody associates that with communism, but really communism is about an economic model, right? And communist governments are all about government regulation in the economy. It's all about regulating the economy, controlling the economy. And Americans pointed out that liberal economic ideas are dangerously drifting in the direction of communism, right? That basically you guys have got communist thought cooked into your thinking, which is why you don't understand how big of a danger communism is. You guys think you're all good to go, but your thinking leads down the road of communism. You're the first step, right? I'm not saying liberals are communists, but the argument that was made by some is how much government regulation? Where does the government regulation stop, right? Where does your anger against the rich stop? Where do the programs stop? Are you going to accept that poverty is just part of human life, or And so there tended to be this concern that liberals, the Democrats, could not handle the war against communism because they themselves were in the direction of communism and sort of espoused some of the basic tenets of communism. At the same time, the Cold War became a bit of a religious crusade, right? Good versus evil. We're the good guys and the communists are the evil guys. And I have to point out that communism is anti-religion. They aren't like separation. They are anti-religion, okay? Karl Marx was anti-religion. Karl Marx one time called religion the opiate of the masses, basically the drug that keeps people calm. He basically said that religion was how the upper class kept the lower class in check by promising them that if they were quiet and they behaved and they followed the rules and they didn't make trouble, that upon their death they would be rewarded. He said that's what they've done throughout time. They convince you to donate your crops or sacrifice or build temples or do whatever, right, for the upper classes to enjoy. And they tell you that that's how we're gonna get the gods on our side, and we're gonna help you. And so communism is anti-religion, very much so. And so for religious people in America, liberalism lost the support of religious Americans who turned to conservatism, right? And that's a big deal because, well, it's the 1940s, 1950s. You still have a lot of Americans who are avid churchgoers and define themselves as religious, etc. So you're going to see a swing in voters there. But that's not all, okay? Let's look at how conservatism made a comeback in the 60s and 70s, okay? This is the groundwork. Now let's work through it. 1955, a young conservative named William F. Buckley founded a magazine called the National Review. His magazine was supposed to provide a platform for conservative writers and thinkers and speakers. Buckley understood that there was a bias in America's media to shut out conservative voices. Now, it wasn't necessarily because they were anti-conservative. It has to deal with, for a long time, liberalism was super popular. And the newspapers and the magazines are going to give the people what they want because they want to sell newspapers and magazines. So there were a lot of political magazines and newspapers and such who'd spent a decade or so catering to liberals because that's who was in power and that's what people supported. And William F. Buckley realized that those editors were still in place and they had a habit of only favoring articles from liberals and they had a liberal readership. And so he created his own magazine, okay? Again, I feel like I've got to clean up all sorts of issues that have arisen in recent American history, okay? The drift of America's media towards liberals, favoring liberalism, is not necessarily part of a nefarious plan, necessarily. There might be a historical component to it. But anyhow, William F. Buckley started his National Review to give conservatives a platform. He also went and he spoke at college campuses and tried to teach college students about conservatism. He talked on the radio and television. He eventually started his own television show, Firing Line. You guys are going to laugh. I watch old episodes of, well, they have to be old because Firing Line went off the air in the early 2000s. But I like to watch some of the old Firing Line episodes from the 60s and 70s. And they were great shows, in my opinion, if you're a person who wants to learn about some of these thinkers and these topics. They were genuine political debate shows where people got to answer, and it wasn't snippets. People talked for minutes on end and were given hard-hitting questions, not the sort of dribble that we get today. So if you're interested in politics and want to learn more, I recommend you watch some of Buckley's Firing Lines. And also, he didn't just talk to fellow conservatives. He invited liberals on there, and they had spicy discussions. And I'm not saying he always came out the winner. But anyhow, he also, in 1960, he invited 90 young conservative leaders to his family estate, and they founded the Young Americans for Freedom, okay? An independent conservative group determined to push their conservative vision, right? These young conservatives were determined to push the Republican Party more conservative. You see, because the Republican Party had noticed that for a long time America had been dominated by liberals, in the 50s, Republicans were playing it more middle of the road because America had been so liberal for so long. They'd won some people to conservatism, but the bulk of America tended to be in the middle or liberal. And so Republicans have been playing middle of the road for years, and they'd basically been a lighter alternative to liberalism. The Young Americans for Freedom and Buckley and such were bent on driving the Republican Party truly conservative. And that's how you got Barry Goldwater in 1964. As we've learned about, Barry Goldwater ran for president. He got destroyed by Lyndon Johnson. He got destroyed. Okay? So maybe these people were a little ahead of the curve. America wasn't ready for a man that conservative. But they redefined the party. And here's where modern American politics is helpful to me. Bernie Sanders redefined the Democratic Party. Okay? His run in 2016 forced Hillary Clinton to say things she would not have said 5 years before. Things she didn't say when she ran against Barack Obama in the primary in 2008. The fact that Bernie Sanders caught on with a certain segment of America's liberal population, even though he didn't win the nomination, Hillary Clinton knew that she needed to cater to those voters to get them on board with her, right? She changed her stance on certain things. The Democratic Party is more liberal and more socialist today than it was 6 years ago. And it's because of Bernie Sanders, right? He moved it. Barry Goldwater did that in 64. He lost, but he moved the Republican Party clearly towards the conservative half. Forget middle of the road, forget compromise. We aren't liberal light, okay? We aren't what liberals vote when they're not voting liberal. We are an entirely different movement. That's what Barry Goldwater did for the conservative movement in 64. Okay? Now, it wouldn't have worked, though, if there hadn't been other things at play. Okay? William F. Buckley cannot make America conservative. What happened? Okay. The Sun Belt. The rise of the South and the West. We've already talked about the Sun Belt a little bit when we talked about World War II and the movement of people for jobs and such. But in the 50s and early 60s, the problem was New England was liberal, right? New England was liberal. And the far west tended to be a little more conservative. And the South was more Democrat, right? The South had always been Democrat. And so okay, let me rephrase this. In the 50s and 60s, the South voted Democrat all the time, every time. The West usually voted Republican, right? And that meant the game was up in the Northeast. If you want to win the election, you got to win the Northeast. Well, the Northeast tended to be more liberal, and it was Democratic, therefore, which means that's why the Democrats were winning in the 40s, in the 50s, and even in the early 1960s, right? Generally speaking, all right, that's how things went. So Republicans did great out west, but they never were able to win enough in the South or the Northeast to win. But in the 50s, you start to see the shift, okay? And that's your other issue, by the way. These people were conservative, but they voted Democrat. They're conservatives, but they vote Democrat. I want you to think about some of these things, okay? States government, states' rights. Gee, sounds like the Confederacy, okay? They like religion. They like the Second Amendment. They like America before civil rights. They like America before. Hello. You're voting the wrong party, South, okay? You're really conservatives. You've got a lot of conservative things going for you, okay? Oh, you're anti-communist. Okay, you know. And so what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen in the 60s? Two things are going to happen, actually. World War II is going to drive a lot of people to the South and West searching for jobs, meaning they moved to the conservative regions of America. Let's not worry about the flip-flop yet. Let's worry about the fact that these regions are conservative. And so Americans start pouring into the parts of the country where conservative values take hold, which means they are more likely to become conservative in their politics. It's called the boom in the Sun Belt, the region basically stretching from the Old South, like go North Carolina straight west, and include Nevada and California in there. And there was a map in your book. Between 1950 and 1980, California's population more than doubled. Nevada's population octupled, or grew by a factor of 8. Arizona quadrupled. New Mexico doubled. Texas doubled. Georgia, not quite doubled. Florida, more than tripled. Okay? And it's not just the presidential vote. Think of the House of Representatives. More and more members of the House will be conservatives, possibly, right? Now, that's only one part of the puzzle. The other part is the Rust Belt, okay? The old American industrial heartland, the Midwest, New England, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, right? Those parts. The parts of America that were once the industrial hub of America are no longer the industrial hub of America. Some of those industrial jobs have left, and they left behind the people who use those industrial jobs, right? Or have those industrial jobs. And those factory workers can't just pack up and move necessarily, right? Also, as America's economy began to struggle, as we learned about previously in the 60s and 70s. We went through this economic decline. Maybe your job just simply disappeared because the work disappeared. It didn't go to California or Texas. It just disappeared. Your job left forever, right? Either it fell to someone in Europe or Asia or whatever, but that job making steel didn't leave Pittsburgh. It left the United States. Like you're out of luck, man. Okay? And so the government is going to start to have all these programs to help these people, right? These people are going to start to look to the United States government to help them with unemployment and Job Corps and this and that and the other, right? And we've got all these programs to help the cities. We've got all these taxes, right? We'll get back to the cities here in a moment and the taxes. But the Americans in the Southwest, the Sun Belt, they were opposed to all this and all these government regulations, right? They're like, wait, why am I paying money to help your state that's falling apart? My state is doing great. My state is doing wonderful. My state is growing, booming. We've got all sorts of money to do all sorts of things. And now you want to take it to D.C. to help save Pittsburgh, to help save Philadelphia, right? To help save Detroit. Why? That's ridiculous. And then you think in the South, those Democrats aren't happy with the federal government stepping up to the civil rights plate. Southerners are not thrilled that it looks like the federal government is going pro-civil rights and enforcing it on them. And as you can see, in 1964, Barry Goldwater did incredibly well in the South, right? Barry Goldwater swept some southern states. It goes to show you, in 1964, Southerners decided to abandon the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, the rest of the country didn't. But there you go. There's the switch. If you can switch the South from voting Democrat to voting Republican, you can team up the South and the West and get enough votes to win. Because people are leaving New England and moving south and west, giving these states more electoral college votes and more representatives in the House, right? So it's the movement. It's the shift of Americans, right? It's the switching of an entire region politically, right? I want to point out, too, people out west don't like the government. People out west got that pioneer thing going on, right? They got that pioneer spirit. We don't need some bureaucrat in D.C. telling us how to live, right? What does a guy in Washington know about, the conditions out here in Idaho? What does some dude at the EPA know about farming, right? What does some dude at the EPA know about what I need to do to water my crops, to feed my animals? And it's called the Sagebrush Rebellion. This idea of they resented government control over land and water and resources and telling these people on the frontier, so to speak, how to live. And so by 1980, there were more people living in the Sun Belt. And the Sun Belt is more conservative, which means they've got more electoral votes, probably more members in the House of Representatives. Okay? Southerners are now voting Republican, not Democrat. We're not done, though, kids. Let me go ahead and ruin it for the liberals a little more. Suburbia went conservative. Fun fact, Suburbia was liberal up until the 60s and 70s. Suburbia was liberal in the 50s. The burbs were liberal. Okay, originally, right? All these people who were able to go out to Suburbia, they had all these kind of, I almost want to harken back to progressive ideals in some ways, right? The original progressivism, not the misused term today. But these people in the burbs watched America's cities burn, right? They watched American cities in the 60s have riot after riot after riot. They watched the cities begin to crumble, the infrastructure begin to crumble. They watched the government institute program after program under the Great Society to save the cities. And these people began to watch their tax dollars go save the cities, which they got out of, right? Remember, they bought a home. They bought a ranch in a suburb. And now they're paying for the very city that they fled. They got out of. They worked their way out. And now remember, it's the 60s, it's the 70s, stagflation. It's becoming harder and harder to earn a living. Right? Inflation is wiping out the nice job that I have, right? My paycheck isn't going as far. I'm having trouble paying for the life that I worked very hard for. And all these taxes are benefiting programs that I don't get. I don't live in the cities. I'm on a minority, right? I'm not on welfare. I'm not this. I'm not that. Why am I paying for that? And the burbs become conservative, right? For example, In 1978, a conservative activist named Howard Jarvis got Proposition 13 passed in California, a referendum to greatly reduce property taxes in the state of California. Yes, once upon a time, California was conservative. I know. Everyone's like, what exactly? Know your history. Okay? A lot of Americans did this. And so middle class America becomes conservative. Middle class America, who had once championed the New Deal and the Great Society, turned around on it and said, I'm sick of your taxes and I'm sick of your programs that don't help me. I'm sick of paying for everybody else's ride in this country. Are we done? No. The religious right. The last group. Okay, I'm creating a coalition here. Okay, I'm creating a coalition. I've got Westerners. I've got Southerners. I've got Southerners who were once Democrat who've now jumped on board, right? I've got Suburbia. Let me get you one more group. Let me get you religious folks. Look at the 60s, kids. The hippies, Woodstock, free love, protesters, draft dodgers, burning draft cards, burning American flags. 1973, Roe v. Wade, legalizing abortion. You know, the increase in crime, supposedly, all these things. There's all sorts of statistics too. The increase in the children born out of wedlock, the increase in the divorce rate, all sorts of things that made religious people go, oh God. The rise of the feminist movement. You know, people challenging traditional gender roles. The idea of a woman doesn't need a man in her life. She can go make her own way. You know, the idea of women striking out on their own, challenging men in the workplace potentially. There's talk of an equal rights amendment. And so people that are very religious felt like America was falling apart because America was losing her moral compass. The very values that have provided structure and foundation for this country for generations. And it was a bunch of different faiths too. It wasn't one, but primarily Protestant, not exclusively, but primarily evangelical Protestants, you know, the sort of born again Christians. Billy Graham, Oral Roberts, people like that are going to begin to preach a message of we need to return to traditional values, moral values. And it was the birth of the televangelists. These people that would have these shows where they would basically preach. I am not going to call Joel Osteen a televangelist, okay? But some of you know who Joel Osteen is, so it's the best metaphor I can give. It's a guy who goes on TV and preaches their message. Now, Joel Osteen's message is far more just strictly religious. These men of the 70s and 80s, and I do remember a few of them from my childhood on television when I was a very little kid, they preached a very religious message, but they were able to weave politics into their message. For example, Pat Robertson, who founded the Christian Broadcast Network, and Jerry Falwell, who used his old-time gospel hour, created what's called the moral majority. Falwell said that he got 2 million people to vote conservative in the 1980 election using his television show alone. But they did. They kept weaving into their shows these messages about conservative politicians and conservative values and how if you truly believe in what we're saying, you need to support this or vote for this, right? But conservatives, religious folk, they go conservative hardcore in the 70s and 80s in reaction to what they saw in the 60s and the 70s, right? The hippies and the drugs, right? And the disco and the alternative lifestyles and all that stuff. Nope, they're not going for that. So they start voting conservative. And what you have is a coalition, okay? What you have is a coalition, a new one, right? The Watergate scandal had destroyed our trust in government, the high taxes, the programs, the rising unemployment, the rising inflation. America was convinced that we were going down the wrong road, right? And you got people desperately wanting some group to stand up and say, we're going to fix it. We're going to make America strong, okay? We're going to fix this economy. We're going to fix the problems in our society. No more of this liberal, do what you want in your own private life and government, right? We know we're going to turn America loose. Politically, we're going to turn America loose. Economically, we're going to turn America loose. Militarily, we're sorry about Vietnam, right? But by the time the Democrats got knocked out and Republicans had a chance, the war was lost. So sorry about that one. We wouldn't have lost that one. Oh, and by the way, while Jimmy Carter was on watch, the Russians violated the Helsinki Accords and the Russians invaded Afghanistan. We're weak and they know it. No more of that. We're going to bulk up. We're going to eat some protein. We're going to lift and we're going to get ready for a throwdown. You know, we're going to bring back traditional American values, the things that made America great. We're going to make America great again. And there's a reason that I just said that. I'm not making fun of Donald Trump. Ronald Reagan came up with that phrase. All right? If you dig down in history, you'll find out that was said by Reagan first. Speaking of which, that will be our final lesson. We will learn about Ronald Reagan. And I will joke about Ronald Reagan and how old white guys love him. Do not be offended. Ronald Reagan shaped the world we live in more than any of the presidents, really, that we've talked about, honestly. Because the policies he created and kind of the movement he created did a lot to shape the world we live in now. So at least for my lifetime, Ronald Reagan is probably the most important president of my lifetime. Granted, I was born in the Reagan years. Actually, no, I was born right before Ronald Reagan became president. I was born right after he won the election, but before he was inaugurated. But Ronald Reagan shaped the America I was raised in and then the America I grew up in. But we'll learn about that in our last lecture.